Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to do a follow-up video to my previous one in which I tried to explain the Back to the Future timeline and all its logical problems with all the multiple timelines getting created and how come there are no copies of the same people being created. Since they time travel and arrive in new timelines, there should be multiple versions of them. So I think in the movies themselves the idea was that they somehow merge together, meaning once Marty arrives into a new timeline, he kind of becomes the Marty of that timeline, and so that seems to be the idea of the movie, but I say it would be more interesting and more logical if there were actually multiple copies, and it could even be used to explain the plot hole of the second movie in which Doc took Jennifer and Marty into the future, and yet they were still in the future despite kind of disappearing in the present, and so that never really made much sense. I guess the movie thought that since the time machine or the timeline somehow knew that they will come back later, to the same time that they left, that's why they are in the future. But if that's the case, shouldn't they know that their younger selves are about to visit them, and so they didn't seem to know that, or they pretended they didn't, and so it creates a whole bunch of problems. So what I'm suggesting is that there are actually multiple copies of them, and I'm going to try to explain exactly what happened to all these copies and to detail all the stuff that kind of happened in between movies and the stuff we didn't see, and to try to come up with theories and excuses to explain all of this mess. And this is all purely for fun, just a thought experiment, just nitpicking the movie and trying to fix it, and so this is all just for fun. So in the first movie we know that Marty changes the timeline when he comes back to the present. It's a different present because his father George is no longer a loser, as well as his siblings are no longer losers, and his mom is now in shape and not a fat alcoholic like in the original timeline, and Doc survived by wearing a bulletproof vest because he knew what's going to happen, so everything was different even before this point. And so the other Marty who jumped to the future again should have created a duplicate Marty even back in 55. There should have been two Martys who appeared with the DeLorean in the past, coming from two separate timelines, and the past is the same, so there should be technically two Martys in the past. So how come it didn't happen? Well, one excuse is that maybe the time machine itself didn't allow it, meaning because there was one Marty who appeared at a certain point in the past, in the place that later would become that mall, and in the past the whole land was owned by that crazy farmer who was trying to breed the pine trees and all of that, and so we know that the first Marty arrived in the past and crashed into that farmer's house, and then a second Marty couldn't have possibly appeared in the same place as the other Marty. So what happened? So maybe the time machine itself kind of glitched and sent him later on in the future. So maybe he simply arrived, the second Marty simply arrived sometime later. So I will give several different versions and theories of how it could have played out. So the first one is that the time machine itself somehow changed the exact date that was inputted, and we know it can happen. It happened in the end of the second movie when the time machine accidentally sent Doc to 1885 and it changed the numbers by itself, and so we know it can happen. So it's possible that because there was another Marty there already, it could not send the same exact Marty into the same location and time, and so maybe it simply sent him a little bit later to the same place. So maybe after the first Marty crashed into that barn, into that guy's home, and that guy thought he's a UFO and tried to shoot him, and then Marty escaped and he ran over one of the trees by accident, and that's why when the timeline changed, the mall became the Lone Pine Mall instead of the Twin Pine Mall, and so that's another clue that the timeline was completely different in the end of the movie compared to the beginning. So what if, and this is just a theory so don't get pissed off, what if the time machine sent the second Marty just a few minutes later, so to avoid them colliding into the same place in space-time? So one Marty pissed off that farmer and escaped, and then a second Marty appeared in the same place and again crashed into his house, and then the old man who had his weapon on the ready now, so he sees the same thing happening again, and then he gets even more pissed off, and so he says, oh, that crazy UFO came back again, this time I'm going to shoot the mutated son of a bitch in the face. And then when Marty walks out again, and it's the second Marty, slightly different one, he simply gets shot in the face by that farmer, and then later the farmer realizes that it's just some kid, it's not an alien, he has red blood, he's a normal human, but he's dead, he killed him, and so he goes into a panic and he decides that he has to hide all evidence of this event. So maybe he then takes Marty's body as well as the DeLorean itself and buries it somewhere where it will never be found, maybe somewhere in the place that later would become the mall, would become that parking lot, and that's why it was never found later. And so that can easily solve the problem of the second Marty appearing due to the glitch in the time machine that sent him a little bit later, he simply gets killed by the farmer who almost killed the first one. And this neatly solves this whole problem of the second Marty. And that's why the second Marty never returned to the future. That's when our Marty came back to the new timeline. In the end of the movie, there is no second Marty who also comes back to the present and then goes into the same bed and then they sleep together in the same bed, so it wouldn't make sense. And so the theory I just suggested neatly explains away why the second Marty never returned to the present, and there's only one Marty in the end, the Marty from the original timeline who now will live in this new timeline, and the other Marty is dead basically. So I think that's kind of a funny theory. And another possibility is that Doc himself dealt with all of this, and I don't mean he killed the other Marty, I mean he realized that it's going to be a problem because he knew it's going to create a new timeline once he read that letter, and once he saw that George will no longer be the loser that Marty said he's going to be. You know, that scene when Marty tells Doc that his father never stood up to Biff, and Doc was surprised and said never, and so he kind of realized there's going to be a new timeline. So maybe, you know, he had 30 years to think about all of this. So he probably realized there's going to be a huge problem later on when he has to send Marty back again. It's going to be a different Marty who was born in this new timeline, and yet he's supposed to send him to the exact same spot in which there's already a Marty from the original timeline there. And so it might create a paradox if the two Martys meet or something. They cannot appear in the same place. And so maybe when he dialed the time in which he has to send him, and we didn't see that scene again, we only saw it from a distance, so we don't know the details of what happened this time. And so I'm saying that maybe Doc planned ahead and he tried to avoid creating a paradox which might destroy the whole universe, and so maybe he deliberately sent the other Marty to a different time period, maybe a week later, or the time in which the other Marty will no longer be in the past, and then he sent the other Marty to a few days later so that he will help him to return to the present again, but to a different spot. And so the only problem with that theory would be, how will he send him again if he will not know when the lightning will strike? Well, there's an easy solution. Maybe this time he simply put another dose of plutonium into the DeLorean, which he forgot to do in the beginning. In the original timeline, he only put one rod of plutonium into the car, and he forgot to put all the other ones, and then he kind of laughed, said, oh, how will I come back? And then he got attacked, and so there was no time to put it. But the second time he knew all of this is going to happen, so maybe he put the rest of the plutonium, and maybe even all of it, into the car, and sent the other Marty into the past, but a week later, with all the plutonium he would need to send him to anywhere he wants to send him. And so what would happen is that the other Marty simply arrives in the past in a slightly later time, and then Doc finds him in time, and so he would hide him away without anyone ever seeing him, and this way he will not mess anything up again. So he will not change anything that was changed already, he will not meet his parents again, he will not interfere in the past again in any way, and will not even know of anything that happened before. Only Doc would know that, and then he can simply use the extra plutonium to send him back into the future. But of course then there will again be two Martys, one from the original timeline and one from the second timeline. So how will Doc solve that problem? Well, maybe that's why he invented the whole trip to the future in the second movie. Maybe he sent the second Marty to come back to the present a day later than the original one, and that way they will never meet. And original Marty, he would take him to the future in the second movie, and that can actually explain why there was a second Marty in the second movie, because if he goes into the future, he shouldn't exist in the future unless there was a duplicate of him already. So it's possible that the Marty from this new timeline is the one we see later in the future, and maybe because he grew up with a dad who was not a loser, who was rich, maybe Marty himself became a loser because of that, because he was a spoiled kid who never had to overcome challenges and difficulties, and so maybe that explains the loser Marty in the future and his kids being losers again and all of that. And so this is not our Marty that we saw in the first movie, this is the second Marty in the new timeline, who grew up to be old in the future. So this actually can neatly explain all of that. Now the big problem is with Jennifer. How come the same thing happened with Jennifer, who never time traveled in the first movie that we've seen, and yet there is a duplicate of her in the future as well? So how can that be? Well, one possible explanation is that maybe she did time travel, that we just didn't happen to see that. Maybe Doc also took her on another adventure, maybe even before he went to the future. You know, he had plenty of plutonium now, so maybe he went on a separate adventure with Jennifer, which also created another Jennifer in the present. When they came back and they changed something small, suddenly there was another Jennifer. Maybe you can even use that to explain why the actress changed, because she's obviously not played by the same actress, and so maybe something happened in the past that changed the present Jennifer. Maybe if Doc took her back to a time before she was born and they accidentally bumped into her father or something, if they just delayed him for 1 minute or even 1 second, and then he went back home, and let's say that was the night in which he was about to have sex with his wife, but he did it all 1 minute later, and because of that a different sperm cell impregnated his wife, and then the Jennifer that was born was slightly different genetically. She was her own sibling, and so she was very similar but also different genetically, and obviously she was named the same way by her parents, and so she grew up the same way. She met Marty, she became Marty's girlfriend, but she's now genetically different to her original version, and so that can explain why there are two Jennifers. Once Doc took Jennifer back into the present, maybe the ripple effect changed her DNA as well, so she became the actress of the second movie, but there was also two Jennifers there because it's also now a different timeline. So maybe this is why Doc actually took Marty and Jennifer into the future, to avoid the problems of having all of these duplicates of them interacting, and so maybe that's why he had to take them into the future. That was the real reason he did that, and not just to help their kids and all of that. And another way to explain all of this is that maybe all of those events happened twice. Maybe originally he tried to take them into the future, but then he saw that because of that they disappeared in the future and their whole family disappeared, and so he realized he made a mistake, and then he went back in time to drop them off, and maybe he used one of his devices from the future to erase their memory, and then simply left them in the past again, then again made another time jump, maybe to a few minutes later or to before that, and there would have been duplicates of them because he dropped them off after a time jump, and so he simply took one of those duplicates and took them to the future, and the other pair stayed in the past, in the present, and lived on to be in the future, and that explains why they are still in the future. So obviously this is a very convoluted way to explain that, and it probably wasn't the intention of the movie itself. The movie seems to imply that simply the timeline knew they were going to come back to the present, and that's why they existed in the future. And also no duplicates of anyone remained because presumably they all fused back together, so the original Marty and the second Marty simply came back into the same place and time in the end of the first movie, and so they're fused into one basically. But it doesn't really make sense to me because he would have the memory of both timelines if that was the case, but he only seems to have the memory of the original timeline. So what happened to the second Marty? And so that's why I came up with these theories to try to explain that. In the second movie everything becomes much more messy after the point in which Old Beef steals the time machine and goes back in time to 55 to give his younger self the sport book that would make him rich, and then he somehow goes back in time to that same future in which Marty and Doc get the time machine back. So first of all, it was very stupid of him to come back there and to leave the time machine for them. If he simply went away to some other time period or some other place and didn't give them back the time machine, then they would be unable to fix anything and he would have remained rich and powerful. So that was his biggest mistake. And another question is, how come he arrived at exactly the same timeline that he left? Now maybe it's not the same timeline. We know that this was in some different neighborhood and not the same place as Hill Valley, and so maybe that place, that other place simply remains exactly the same. And since Marty and Doc were time travelers, the changes in the timeline didn't affect them, and that specific neighborhood didn't change, and so they didn't notice anything until they tried to come back in time to back to 85, and only then they noticed the changes. Also, it's possible that simply by that time in the future the other Beef died. That could explain why the Old Beef disappears in the deleted scene when he comes back with the time machine, and in the final movie, the theatrical version, we can see that he kind of gets sick or something. And so one of the theories is that the Old Beef somehow died, that maybe his wife shot him or something, and so he was dead by that point, and maybe the whole place returned to normal after that to exactly as it would have been without that different timeline. And so maybe the future, at least in that area of the city that they were in, it was exactly the same, and they were somehow protected from the changes of the timeline. They did not disappear because they were time travelers, just like Jennifer did not later disappear when they fixed the timeline. They left her in the Hell Valley timeline in 85, then they time traveled some more, and then in the end of the third movie, Jennifer was totally fine after waking up. So it's as if the changes in the timeline do not immediately affect the person who time traveled, and possibly that person also gets fused with his version or her version in that timeline. So there's only one in the end. So that's kind of the movie's logic in my opinion, even though I don't like it. I prefer something more logical and convoluted. So I don't like, people fusing together. So the other Jennifer somehow disappeared, the other Marty disappeared. It doesn't really make sense. So I propose a more convoluted theory to explain everything. So we can say that when Biff returned to the future, maybe the changes that he made in the past simply didn't reach the future yet, and so they got the time machine back, and then they time traveled to the past, and by then it did reach that point in the past, and so they arrived into the other new timeline of 85 in which Biff was rich and powerful. And the reason we didn't see another Marty, we actually had a good excuse in the movie when Biff said that he's supposed to be in Switzerland. That was the perfect excuse to explain why there isn't yet another Marty, a different Marty in this new timeline, who grew up in this new timeline in which Biff killed his dad and all of that. So we never actually got to see that other potential Marty. So we can guess that he was still there. He was simply really in Switzerland. That's why we don't meet him, we don't get to see him. And the other Doc was in a mental asylum. We know that because Doc showed it in a newspaper that that's what happened to him. So that's why there isn't another Doc that we get to meet. Meaning he does exist, he's still alive in a mental asylum, and the other Marty is in Switzerland. And so there are duplicates of them in this new timeline, we just don't get to see them. So then they want to fix this timeline, so they leave Jennifer on a bench in this hellish timeline, saying that she'll be totally fine once they fix the timeline somehow, even though shouldn't she have a duplicate of herself still existing? I mean, even if they fix the timeline, how can she stay in the bench? I mean, the Jennifer who would have lived in that timeline should have been in a different place, unless in that timeline they also time traveled to the future and they took her with them, and that's why she's not there. So it kind of makes no sense. So there should have been another Jennifer there in the end of the third movie after everything came back to normal seemingly. It came back to what it was in the end of the first movie with George being successful, Biff being a loser who washes his car and all of that. But how come there are no two Jennifers? How come Jennifer woke up on the bench and apparently she's the only one? So where is the other Jennifer who should be here? Unless they somehow fused together, but why was she fused and still be on the bench? I mean, did the other Jennifer simply disappear so that this one can take her place? And so it makes no sense. Now maybe there are still duplicates of them. Maybe not everything was fixed by the end of the movie. Maybe later on they discover they have a bunch of duplicates of themselves. And maybe all of this can actually explain the problem I had earlier on, because if we know that thanks to all this time traveling there is now a duplicate of Jennifer whom they left on the bench, maybe it can explain why earlier on they could take her to the future and she was still there in the future as an old lady. And so maybe it was because of this other copy of her that was created by the time traveling that happened later. And so we have to kind of think four-dimensionally and not linearly, and then maybe it would make sense because we know there's going to be a different timeline who will form later. So technically from an outside observer it's as if all of these timelines always existed, and so maybe that's why there was a duplicate of Jennifer back in 85, and that's why Doc was able to take her to the future and she was still there as an old lady in the future, because he later will leave her in the past again in a different timeline. And so maybe that's why we can explain that. So just like Marty has a duplicate because of the time traveling in the first movie, maybe Jennifer has a duplicate because of the future time travel which we didn't yet see, and yet we already see the effects of it. So there's a second Jennifer already because a dog from an alternate reality dropped her off there already. So also, you know, with the existence of a time machine, there has to be like a million different timelines now that we didn't get to see simply. There has to be different variations and all of that. So technically there should be a whole lot of mess that we don't even get to see. So this can be used to explain why there was a duplicate of her already before we even see the events that caused her to become a duplicate. And so later on, Doc and Marty traveled back to 55 to try to prevent Biff from becoming rich and all of that. And they also caused him to crash his car into manure again, which maybe is why he went into the business of washing cars later, because he had to do it with his own car. And then maybe he was good at it, and then he started his own business of washing cars and all of that thanks to all those events with the manure, and so that can explain the loser Biff in the future. And then Doc accidentally gets sent back to 1885, and then Marty meets the Doc from 55 to get his help to send him back to 1885 as well. So they find the time machine that Doc buried in the past to send Marty to the past as well. And from there they go back to the future in the end of the third movie. But of course they also had to have made some changes in the distant past as well. For example, saving that lady who was about to fall into that canyon. They saved her, and because of that the canyon was later named the Eastwood Canyon, because everybody thought that Marty died there and he called himself Eastwood. So we know that it's yet another timeline in the end. So again, I will have to ask the question, why are there not multiple copies of Marty and Jennifer and everybody at this time point? since it's yet another timeline. Maybe this stuff changed, and maybe that can explain why the actor who plays George also changed his appearance. How come he looks different? We know that the actor simply didn't return to the role, and so maybe because Marty met his ancestors in the past, they had sex at a slightly different time, and a slightly different sperm cell impregnated Marty's great-grandfather or his father's grandfather or whatever. I lost count, but anyway, it might have caused the genetic chain reaction, which made his father, George, look slightly different than he looked like in the original movie, but everything else was exactly the same. I guess it's possible. And so we can use all of this stuff to explain away all the errors in the movie. And so maybe by the end of the third movie, maybe there are numerous copies of everybody running around. Maybe there are numerous Martys and numerous Jennifers, and then Doc takes his train time machine to time travel, so that could explain why he's not around, and there might be another Doc who lived in this new timeline in this time, and so maybe Doc is still around even though he also has a family in some other time period. And maybe Jennifer and Marty will have to become time travelers now, or to just move to a different area, as not to interfere and not to collide with their other selves who exist in this new timeline. So maybe all of that did happen after the movie was over and we just didn't get to see it. We didn't get to see them coming home and seeing there's another Marty and Jennifer there, who are maybe genetic siblings of themselves and they look slightly different. And you know, maybe that could have been an interesting way to kind of recast everyone and to do a sequel with different actors and simply explain that because of all the time traveling that they became genetic siblings of themselves, and that's why they look different. So I actually don't think I would mind a good, if it was done well, I wouldn't mind a sequel to these movies because it has so much potential. But they would have messed it up and did it stupidly. And if there is ever a reboot, maybe Marty will be a girl this time, Martina or something. And if that happens, I will use the same excuse and I will say that because of the changes in the timeline, maybe a different sperm cell impregnated Marty's mom, and then Marty was born as a girl and not as a boy. And that would make sense because even though the same egg would have been in the womb, but only the father's DNA determines if it's going to be a boy or a girl. And so if a different sperm cell out of millions would have impregnated the same egg, it could be a different gender as well. And so maybe Marty would become Martina and Jennifer would be born as a boy, and then they can still be together or something, or maybe they'll just both be girls or boys or whatever. I'm sure in the distant future maybe someone will remake this movie and do a reboot or something, so I guess we'll wait and see. So anyway, all of this was just for fun, so let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below. I'm willing to discuss all of this in great detail, so please let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, please subscribe, click the notification bell to see updates of new videos. Consider supporting me on Patreon. All the links to all my other channels are in the description below as well, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.